Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's session of Your Voice, a Q&A with me, Whitey. Thanks so much for joining us. And first things importantly, make sure you got your morning tea ready. You got that cup of coffee or a cup of tea. You can see I've made my own coffee this morning. Otherwise, I'd have that mug that says grumpy old man on it again. That would be my wife. Anyhow, make sure you got your coffee and some morning tea. Get ready to sit back and relax and enjoy the conversations that we're going to have this morning. And we're going to talk about what's happening in other countries around the world, and in particular in Canada. But before we go to that, we must thank our sponsors for supporting us. They do a fantastic job in backing what we do, the FBAA. And these are the people that make things possible for us to deliver our content free to our members, whether we're doing these face-to-face or whether we're doing face-to-face or these sort of webinars, or whether it's our conference. It's people like these that help us deliver that as free content to our members. So great thanks to all of them for their continued support of the FBAA. Well, now I'd like to welcome our special guest today, Samantha Gale, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Mortgage Brokers Association. Sam, welcome to Q&A with Whitey. How are you?
Good, very good, thank you. Nice to be here.
Excellent. Great, I'd love you to see you again. I trust you're keeping well over there.
Yes, we're going through the whole COVID experience along with the rest of the world, and doing just fine.
Yes, yeah, that's fun and games. So we're just come on 11:30 here. You'd be what, about 6:30 where you are?
6:30. Yes, my daughters are currently cooking dinner with onions. My eyes start to water.
Oh, lovely. That's all right. You'll be glad to get into that once we finish here. Oh, look, thanks so much for taking time to be with us. It's really appreciated. And it's today's a really important conversation. In Australia, we are constantly being compared to the markets in Canada. So, you know, there's a huge amount of relevance and importance in the conversations that we're going to have this morning about those two markets, and together with other things that are happening in other markets around the world I know we can touch on. But I guess before we start, it'd be lovely if we can is to get a little bit of a background on you, Sam, and a bit about your career as to how you've wound up doing what you're doing at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, like everything in life, sometimes you don't plan on ending up where you are. I started out as a lawyer. I went and I got a law degree. And I was doing a lot, you know, I had about a 10-year practice, and I was doing a lot of, you know, mortgage and real estate work, along with some other work as well. And from there, I went to work for our regulator. So I actually got involved in regulating the real estate industry here. And I won't get into that, but it was, you know, interesting, real estate development work, etc. And the same regulator actually regulated the mortgage broker industry. So halfway through, I ended up doing regulatory work for 15 years. And for about half of that, 7 years, I actually regulated the mortgage broker industry. And then after I did something that very few people do, I actually left government to go and work with industry. And so after 15 years, I decided, you know, it's time for a break, for a change. And it was an opportunity with our association, our Mortgage Brokers Association. And so I took it, and I've been with the association here for, I think it's going on 6-7 years now.
Fantastic, fantastic. Yeah. I mean, that background would stand you in an extremely good position when having to lobby with governments and talk to regulators and formulate conversations and positions around policies that are impacting industry. That's extremely valuable for the brokers there in Canada to have someone like you who is actually taking the charge on things like that, because it's unlike me, I've never done a law degree. I never finished high school, but I have been in the industry a long time. But it's invaluable, the knowledge that comes from what you've been doing in that particular marketplace. That's really interesting. Thanks for sharing that with us, Sam. Let's talk a little bit about CMBA. So I'll tag it as our sister association. We have a connection through IMBF, which we'll talk about a bit later. But some of the things I guess within Canada is structured differently because of how Canada itself operates as a country. But again, we'll talk about that a bit later. But how is CMBA structured? So you're in BC, you're in Vancouver area, is that right?
Yeah. CMBA, it's the Canadian Mortgage Brokers Association, is an umbrella association representing different provincial. We have provinces, equivalent to states, and so we've got individual provincial associations under the CMBA umbrella. And so I'm with CMBA BC, but I also work with the CMBA umbrella, and we operate, feet on the ground. It's a grassroots at the provincial level. It's all local events and local advocacy work. But then there's much in common with our provincial associations across Canada, and that's where CMBA came in. So we produce a magazine across Canada. We do lobbying, government lobbying across Canada as well, on probably many of the same issues that you look at in Australia. So it's much, I've discovered that most associations, where you've got national and then either state or provincial jurisdictions underneath, operate under a similar structure. There's sort of little tweaks and differences along the way, but that's how we work. So we collaborate with our other provincial associations under the CMBA umbrella to tackle some of these issues.
Excellent. And it's like for here, we have state presidents and councillors in each state, or provinces as you have over there. So I guess there's a similar sort of structure in one respect, is that state-based or provincial-based representation with the umbrella national group. Slight differences, but it has a bit of a parallel there. And how do you, how many brokers are there, do you know, within Canada? Is it a big market, small market, or how many, what does that look like in Canada?
I would say we have about 4,000 in British Columbia, about 3,000 in Alberta, and then in the provinces of Saskatchewan and Manitoba, there's about 500. In Ontario, there's about 10,000, so that's a pretty big province. In Quebec, there's about 2,000. And then in the Atlantic provinces, there's about 400 or 500. So
that's getting close to about 19,000 somewhere.
Yeah, altogether.
Yeah, isn't that funny? Because here in Australia, based on our regulator, which is called ASIC, the Australian Securities Investment Commission, on their register, and when you wash against the duplications and so on in there, we're roughly about 19,500 brokers in Australia. And what's the population there?
I think we're a little bigger than Australia. What are we?
30 million, isn't it?
38 million is what we've got.
38,
here.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay, and we're sitting about 25, 26.
Yeah.
So, but it's interesting that, I was going to say worlds apart, but we're oceans apart. But here's where the similarities start to play. Yes, you've got a bigger population, but the structure of associations are very similar or have similarities. The number of brokers is similar. What about the banks there in Canada? Do they all support the brokers, or only some of them?
No, the banks, by and large, don't. There are a couple. There are a couple of. We've got 5 big banks here in Canada that are what they call too big to fail, like huge banks. And there's two big banks that support the brokers, and then there's smaller banks that support the brokers as well. So we've got the banks, a couple of these banks, and then but we've also got something called monoline lenders, lenders that are exclusively designed to offer financing, mortgage financing through the broker channel. They have no direct consumer contact. and these are very significant partners for mortgage brokers. So very important. And then we've got the mortgage investment corporations. We call them MICs. I don't know if you've got something similar in Australia. You've got shareholders who purchase shares in a mortgage investment entity, and then that entity then lends out. So we call them MICs.
Okay, no, we don't have that so much, but we certainly have those alternative lending sources. We call them the non-banking sector, who have no retail distribution, no branch network, and are purely reliant upon broker distribution of product. But our four major banks here all do deal directly or do transact with brokers as well as their direct channels. It's an interesting player in my mind to your bankers there, because is there, I would have thought there's potential to create a disparity between those top 5 bankers that you've got. For the ones that are using the broker channel, potentially you have more business heading their way than the retail channel. Does it, that's a perception, does it play out that way, or is it still fairly even spread amongst the mix of those major 5?
I think it's fairly even. You know, what's really interesting is that some of these non-bank lenders, the monoline lenders, are as big as the banks. So wow. Some of them are really, really significantly, large, and people often don't understand their regulation. You know, they're quite bank-like, and for that reason, they're not considered as, basically a private lender. They're looked at more as an institution. So I think that there's a perception that they are banks. You know, often the public will confuse them with banks just because of their size and their institution. Yeah.
Okay, so that's great. What about the property market in Canada? And I guess, like Australia, the average value of a property varies between states, provinces in your case. But what does that sort of look like, say, for Vancouver, just to put a peg in the ground? And so, what's the average property worth, and then what's the average lender gets that sort of property? Is there sort of a rough gauge that sits around all that?
Yeah, so, we've got our major urban centers, Toronto, being basically Toronto and Vancouver, are quite expensive, and they probably compare in a lot of ways with Sydney. For Vancouver, to buy a lot, just sort of the dirt, you're probably going to pay 1.5 million Canadian dollars.
Wow.
Yeah, you might have some kind of house on it, but it's not going to be a great house. Yeah. And you're looking at, you can probably buy something, really squeeze in there, maybe at 1.2 or 1.3. But that's, that price level is really challenging. And yeah, it's expensive. You can buy condos, probably for about 400,000 or 500,000 starting. And what's amazing is that we've got all of these new condos, and they're, they really are a shoebox. And people will pay $800,000, $900,000, $1 million, $1,000 a foot for new construction.
Wow, that sounds a lot like Sydney.
Yeah. I mean, obviously these prices aren't elsewhere. The farther out of the urban centre you go, the less it is. It's still not cheap. So in the outer area of Toronto, if you go 2 hours outside of Toronto, you can pick up a nice little house for about 400,000 or 500,000. So it does make a difference if you're out of the urban centres, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of similarities in Sydney with that, and then also as they reflect in, for us, it would then follow probably similar in Melbourne, not so much up here in Brisbane where I am, and then the other states are cheaper again, but there'd be similarities between the provinces as to how that flows as well. It's interesting, the marketplace. And coming back to the broker market and thinking a little bit more in line with the property and regulations and so on, you said there's we'll call it even money, 19,000 brokers thereabouts. What's the commission structure paid there? So in Australia, we get an upfront and then what we call trail. So we get about, depending on you know, the methodologies, but ASIC put out a report, our regulator, report 516, so it said the average broker gets 0.54% upfront and 0.15 trail. Some brokers get a lot more than that. But do you have that sort of structure, or is it a different structure again?
It's relatively similar. So you're a broker out there doing what we call a business. You know, a business is, you know, what we conventional, simple residential transactions. You know, your bank-like customers. And if you do those sorts of deals, you're gonna, it varies, but you're gonna get paid anywhere between 0.5 to 1.1% of the mortgage value. If you're doing private mortgages, you're probably going to, as a standard private rate, you're going to get 1 to 2% of the private mortgage principal amount.
As an upfront.
As an upfront. Yeah. We probably don't have, you know, we do have trailer commissions, but it's probably less common here than it is in Australia, I think.
Yeah, my understanding is that the trailer commission component there in Canada is actually written into your legislation as being okay. Is that correct? Did my memory serve me right on that?
It's actually not part of our legislation.
Okay.
In cases. Yeah, but it is you know, we probably have a similar licensing cost of credit disclosure structure as you do in Australia. One thing I should mention when we're comparing our two countries is how similar we really are. So Canada, like Australia, is a new country. And one of the benefits that we have had here in Canada is to create something called a torrent system. The torrent system is different from these older countries. So in England, for example, you know, going back 1,000 years, you had something called a deed system. So with the deed, you know, you had to trace the chain of ownership and make sure the chain was good, and you actually had some physical, you know, deed piece of paper that you exchanged. With Torrens, who actually was an Australian and created the system there in Australia, it was a simpler system. So the face of the title, you look it up on the system, there's an assumption that the owner who's recorded as the owner is actually the owner. You don't have to trace the ownership. And it was a more simple registry system with different set of legal entitlements that most modern jurisdictions, countries, wish to adopt. And so a lot of them have tried to let go of the old deed system and adopt the torrent system. So the advantage to Australia and Canada is that we started out with a very, very modern system of land ownership and a registry system based on what we call the torrent system. And so we've borrowed, you know, right from the get-go, we borrowed your system of land ownership.
Nice.
Yeah, thank you, Australia. Yeah, it was good.
Well, we love the torrent title system. It works well. I can remember my early banking days doing the investigations on what you're talking about on that chain of title. And there could be a pile of documents this big that you had to go through and check every transaction as it moved from one person to the other to make sure there was no errors in those transmissions to create a solid chain of title for ownership to then move on to the next person. It'd be fascinating to have it from a historical record point of view, some of those documents, but in the Australian system, when we got out of that decades ago, every time you transacted a document, when it went into the land titles office, it went in as a chain of title and came out on the torrent system. So they all disappeared into the ether somewhere. But yes, it certainly has made transacting on property a hell of a lot easier. And it's interesting how, again, we follow similar paths. And it's so relevant because I talk a lot here in Australia as to why you and I basically set up this thing called IMBF. I'll talk more about it later, but you know, our regulators look to you, you guys look to us to actually formulate policies and procedures within our countries. and therefore, it's so imperative that we have an overlapping conversation to understand what's probably going left instead of right, or right instead of left, that can happen from times, and what the learnings are from them. So yeah, it's great, actually. I must admit, we're separated by distance, but not necessarily by how we actually operate in our processes. The one thing I meant to ask before, how long has CMBA been going? That was a question I meant to ask you before.
We started out as individual provincial associations, and in BC, British Columbia, we've been around, our association's been around for 30 years. Our mortgage broker licensing legislation has been around since 1972.
Yeah.
I'm not.
Okay. Well,
we had actually we've got one of the most original statutes here, creating a licensing system here in British Columbia.
Oh, very good. So the FBAA as an example, I think now is 27 years old. So a few years older than us, a couple of years ahead. And although we adopted a national licensing system in 2010, prior to that, there was a whole lot of state variations, and Western Australia was our originating state that started the whole licensing or formal licensing structure. I remember way back in the late 80s, I was a broker in New South Wales, and I was licensed in that state, but it was a very different frameworks to what we have today, and they've evolved, and obviously a damn sight better than what they used to be. It's interesting. It's again, the journeys converse. Can you talk to me a little around the regulations that apply to brokers there in Canada, as to the obligations of a broker, and what a little bit about what that looks like there? I mean, we have very strict rules on top of our heads, and there seems to be a never-ending tightening of that screw.
Exactly.
What's it like over there in Canada?
Well, the original foundation of the licensing program is one of capturing compliance through licensing and doing a suitability analysis, seeing that you're qualified. We've had fairly rigorous education qualification requirements. So there's licensing, so you're defining a group of people that need to comply. But in terms of the compliance, historically, it's what we would call a disclosure-based system. Regulators have been loath to interfere with business decisions. They just want you to do your business, but make closure of everything. So the idea is that you disclose conflicts of interest, and so there's various conflict disclosure requirements throughout the provinces. There's something, this is pretty well universal throughout all Western jurisdictions. There's something called cost of credit disclosure, where you're just for residential mortgages, where you're disclosing the key fundamental elements of a mortgage, including the APR, the annual percentage rate, and the overall total cost of credit. Now, I think as we move down and down in current times, what we're starting to see is the imposition of more rules that in our country look a lot more like securities regulation. So the securities regulation involves suitability assessments, best interest standards. So we're starting to talk, I think you've got that already, we're starting to talk about it. Yeah. So the regulators we've all discovered that a disclosure regime simply isn't enough. And one of the challenges with disclosure and relying on disclosure as your primary consumer protection mechanism is that you end up with like piles of documents that just people don't pay attention to, they don't read, they don't understand. I know that I've talked to some lawyers and some notaries that do conveyancing, and they will have an entire a table the size of a dining room table, stacked with paper. for one file, for one simple file, for some poor borrower, someone to come in and sign. And so what we've discovered is that disclosure doesn't really work the way we thought it would. You know, it's too much information. And then what we really want is for the mortgage broker professional to actually exercise some judgment and care in how they are originating mortgages. And so we're starting to see suitability standards. You have to assess the needs of, you know, we deal with investors and borrowers. You have to assess the needs of an investor or a borrower and make sure what you're providing to them is appropriate, is suitable. So that's starting to creep in. So I think we're looking at your jurisdiction to get some guidance on that.
I have, when you're talking about disclosure and people not reading things, and I've seen that going back to my original banking days in the 70s in Australia. People don't read things, but I have a saying that I use in front of regulators and politicians that I pinched from a good friend of mine with his okay for me to do that, but it is disclosure and comprehension are not synonyms. And it is so true. They are not synonyms. And so just because you disclose things doesn't mean that people actually comprehend what's actually going on. You actually have to have some form of education for them to actually really get that knowledge of what it is that's going on. And it's a really difficult piece. And of course, your comments about suitability of products. We went through when we brought out the NCCP of loans not being unsuitable for a client's use because the industry and regulators who are shaping this bit of policy couldn't come to agreement of what a suitable loan actually was. So what did suitability mean? Was it completely suitable, a little bit suitable, partially suitable? No one could answer it. So they stuck with not unsuitable. But now, and as you're talking about, we now move in and have had legislation passed on our best interest duty, where principally that means you put the borrower's needs in front of your own. And it's largely to make sure you're not driven by commission or other sort of incentives. And as would be in Canada, I mean, brokers act in the best interest of clients anyhow. This frames a bit of policy and regulation around it just to firm it up. But in combined with that, we also have a responsible lending duty, and that's where that unsuitability piece plays in, as well as what we call design and distribution obligations. Now that's actually mainly on the lender, that the broker needs to be aware that the loan product they're going to be using, and this is a piece just coming in, it's not quite here yet, but the loan that they're providing has actually met the obligations under law under a product that complies with the design and distribution obligations. So the product's got to be right, you've got to act responsibly and in the best interest of the client. The old disclosure thing just hasn't played out.
It didn't. You know, the silly thing about disclosure, you know, you probably have some cost of credit disclosure from the
Yeah.
like the legislatures, the regulators have a concept in mind, a theory behind the consumer protection aspect of whatever they're doing. So with cost of credit disclosure, you had this number, the APR, which is intended to be a objective, a singular number. So you can compare the APR of one mortgage versus the other. And it was this brilliant, some academics, some intellectual had this brilliant idea about what it should look, mortgage, you know, consumer protection legislation should look like. And they thought, this is it, this is going to work. So you can get consumers shopping around for mortgages with this APR, that APR, and then they get to make their choice. Well, of course, in reality, things never transpire like that, you know, because they shop for one mortgage at a time. It's not like I've got 10 different mortgage options with 10 different APRs in front of them. It just doesn't work like that. And so what we're finding, what I see now at this juncture is a challenge for regulators to actually enforce. So some things like disclosures, it's more black and white than best interest standards, suitability requirements. That's a little fuzzier, the concept is fuzzier. And I see regulators, you know, including on the security side, having a challenge with enforcement. So we're seeing very few decisions coming out from regulators, the courts, etc., tackling these issues. And so one of the challenges.
Yeah, the APR always. Sorry, go on, Sam.
Oh yeah. Anyway, so I'm just saying that the proof is in the pudding. So we're talking about best interest standards, product suitability. Does it actually work? And we've had some fairly egregious cases here in Canada. In Ontario, in Toronto, we have these things called syndicated mortgages. I don't know if you know what those are. It's where you've got
we do, yeah. We don't have them.
Yeah, we had this one, fairly egregious case where the syndicated mortgages were pretty much a sham. Inflated appraisals, and when somebody purchased, they were investors. When they purchased a syndicated mortgage interest, approximately 30% of their investment funds went towards fees. Broker fees.
Wow.
Yeah, it was. It was kind of looking a little bit like a Ponzi scheme, and it was very commission focused. So the participants involved, the brokers, were heavily focused on earning commissions. And in this jurisdiction of Ontario, they actually did have a suitability requirement, and the regulators never pursued any kind of remedy along those lines, and it was just a glaring question. Why hasn't the regulator enforced the suitability requirements? Because this product isn't suitable for anyone. You're not going to pay those 30% of the money you lend someone and have it go to pay fees. That just isn't a suitable product. And so I don't know what it's like in Australia, if you've got a similar problem. Are you seeing enforcement play out correctly?
Probably not so much, starting to, but this is a part of this design and distribution orders that are coming out, and obligations, where that's the design of a product that you say, well, that's actually not suitable for somebody. So our regulator, ASIC, has the powers to come in and say, we are now legally banning that product because it's not suitable for whatever the reasons are that fall within that framework of the design of that particular product. So we're entering into that phase, and I'm not sure on the exact timing as to when the formal legalities of it start, but ASIC will be enforcing those regulations, that piece of regulation, very strongly at the lender side to say, yeah, you just can't do that anymore. That's gone. We've seen it a bit in the payday lenders. I don't know if you have something similar like that, where it's $1,000 and they're charging 400% enormous fees and things like that. So that's already been clamped under what we call our National Consumer Credit Protection Act, and the variation they have for small cap lenders. So there's a bit of capture there, but it's going to get a lot stronger from that point of view to make sure that suitability piece, or in our case, not unsuitable, is something that can start to be more readily defined. Otherwise, it becomes a debate and a he said, she said in a court of law, which really isn't where the intent of things are meant to wind up. Meant to get it right day one. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how all those play out. An interesting conversation at the moment, and I'm actually commentated in the media today on this, but volume bonuses. Do your brokers in Canada get extra overriders on top of their commissions if they write a certain level of volume? And that may constitute having special broker clubs that are a part of, because they're a high performer based on volume and get preferential treatment. Over here, we're looking to move, well, we actually moved away from that from the report ASIC put out a couple of years ago. But I'm still finding, and I'm getting our members writing to me, basically complaining about these things whereby they have an A-grade borrower, but because they haven't given this lender any volume over 3 months, it's taking up to 30 to 40 days to actually look at the loan file from day one, let alone process it anywhere. It's absolutely atrocious. And that then impacts on the client who's trying to do whatever they're doing through their financing, and there's this enormous delay at the beginning. And it's because it's preferential treatment. If you give a certain lender a high volume, that cuts down to 1 to 8 days. Now, in my mind, that goes against a lot of the things that we've put in place in Australia to stop that incentivization, because it creates steering. And as a regulator, you'd understand that, or past regulator, you'd understanding, I would imagine there, that steering somebody in a certain direction for a gain is not necessarily a good thing. But I was curious, do you have anything like that in Canada or not?
Absolutely, yeah. No,
Yeah.
The Canadian mortgage broker compensation model very much includes volume bonuses. And so the volume bonuses are paid to the broker houses, and so it very much has shaped our industry here. So with the rise of volume bonuses, we've seen the merger of mortgage brokerages. So we've got bigger and bigger mortgage brokerages. They're trying to catch up that big volume bonus under their house.
Yeah. So that's a big umbrella, like an aggregator we have here in Australia.
Yeah.
So does that actually get passed down to the individual broker, or does the house claim it?
It depends on the brokerage. So yeah. I mean, so there's no hard and fast rules. Some broker owners will pass it down to their individual brokers and pull part of it, and some will keep it at the top. So it all depends on the particular brokerage and the model, but very much it's not only shaped the way brokerages are structured, it's created these things called submission desks. So with following the problems we had in 2008, lenders decided they needed to be more efficient. So they've got efficiency ratios, that kind of thing. And they had maybe a broker list of 1,000 names, and they scaled that down to like 40 or 50 names. Massive reduction in the brokers they would deal with. And so you have a designated broker who is going to be submitting deals to the lender. And so what that's done is it's created a channel. So the other brokers utilize that particular broker. They have to do, and our licensing structure isn't designed for this. So it creates a complex set of relationships where the submitting broker isn't actually the mortgage broker on the file. It's some other broker that's doing a co-broker transaction. To take advantage of the ability to submit to that particular lender. So compensation really is at the heart of really how the industry is shaped and how it works, and it makes things very complex, and it creates, I think, a problem with lack of understanding, transparency, comprehension with the public. The public simply don't understand how will these relationships work.
And I imagine it does create steering then, because it's it's been driven down a certain funnel because of a volume overrider. We tried to change that model so it was, the emphasis was on quality. So basically, if you're putting in a transaction that was 100% complete on day one, you'd wind up in this little broker club and you'd get priority, which is better than, to me, being driven by the old money. But to me, it still doesn't play out in the client's interest, because the borrowers, they're going, well, I'm an A-grade borrower, but why am I waiting all this period of time when other people are maybe not as good a borrower, yet because the broker is in this little club because of the quality of submission, and at the moment it's still being driven by volume as well, unfortunately, in some cases. I get to the bottom of the pile and I'm waiting more than a month for my file even to be looked at, not even processed. I find that's a terrible disadvantage to the borrower that shouldn't be there. And all borrowers should be treated equal in my books. And these things shouldn't play out. It's reflective in the Australian marketplace, and that's my view. And there's probably a lot of people that probably may not agree with me, but I can see the challenges that it brings up, especially as we go into a best interest duty, which applies from January of next year, that if I am acting in the best interest of the client and putting their priorities in front of mine, and this particular lender and their loan is the most suitable or not unsuitable for their needs, and I'm acting responsibly in my obligations, yet that's going to take a month for it even to be looked at. And so I may be forced to go down another path that's not necessarily in the complete best interest of the client, because the file's not getting looked at quickly, but it's not my fault, it's the broker, it's a lender issue. But yeah, that's a challenge for us, but it's interesting to understand how that works in Canada. And I can see some of the challenges and complexities that puts into the system. And again, that education piece or that comprehension piece with borrowers understanding exactly what is or isn't going on in the background.
And also it raises another issue too, which is we find that a lot of the regulation is focused on the broker, and we're just starting to look at regulation on the lender. Historically, our regulators used to say, we don't need to regulate lenders. It's their money, just leave them alone. We need to regulate the brokers who represent and deal with the brokers, sorry, the borrowers. And so we've had fairly light regulation of lenders. If a lender's not getting to an application review for 30 days, is that not a problem with lender behavior? And I'm not sure how lenders are regulated in Australia. It's complex here in Canada. There's different regulators for different lenders.
Oh, for different lenders. No, we have APRA, the Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority, that overlies all banks. Anyone who takes money from borrowers, what we call deposit-taking institutions, they are all governed by APRA. Everything else falls under ASIC. Principally like that anyhow. So ASIC has broader powers across all the other alternative lenders or non-bank lenders, depending on where they sit on the deposit-taking side of things. And so although there's a couple of regulators, it's not terribly complex to work out what rules you've got to play from, but they've all got to play from very certain rules. And I'm sure some of our people over here might like the way your rules are written over in Canada. We'll leave them over there for the moment. That one you can keep. So I imagine that creates some challenges, because that would impact, I guess you got over there, but we have private lenders as well as another tier again. So if you basically, I won't say you're a beast unto yourself, but if the regulation is loose or too complex and there's holes in the fence somewhere, I imagine, are there any issues with private lenders if you have them over there in Canada?
We have a lot of focus on private lenders. There's a a lot of terminology that's being used by media and to certain case by regulators and politicians. They are referred to as shadow banks. I don't know if you've heard that. Shadow lenders, shadow banks. There's a misunderstanding, I think, with a lot of media and even government, that they think that private lenders aren't regulated because they're not regulated prudentially like a bank. And they think there's only one way to regulate. They only understand bank regulation. And we have something here called OSFI that regulates bank conduct, deposit takers. But private lenders have regulation too. It's what we call market conduct regulation. It's not prudential. So we're concerned about protection rules. So one of the concerns would be about quality of service and whether you're waiting to 30 days to approve an application. The problem that we've got is that, like I say, regulators here have historically neglected the lending component of regulation. They've just focused on the borrowers. And I think to a large extent, they don't understand lending. And they don't understand what they ought to be looking at and regulating when they look at lending behavior. So we've had fairly relaxed regulation, and that's changing now. There is a big focus on money laundering, and all of this discussion in the media around shadow banking, shadow lending. there's a lot of pressure to start regulating private lending in a tighter way. I'm not quite sure what that's going to look like, and I don't think anybody knows. But you know, we're obviously going to be looking at you know, AML rules. So I've taken a look at some of your rules there in Australia, and you know, I think that suitability is going to be product suitability is going to be a bigger element. You know, you have to put all those pieces together and come up with some kind of comprehensive. But it's
yeah. Do the regulators, do the regulators look at things provincially or on a national level?
It depends who they are. Our regulators, we actually have a problem here in Canada with nationalizing certain things. We have a constitution, you know, if you hear in the United States, you hear a lot of reference to their constitution. And here we've got a constitution that we've had since about the 1860s. And it creates a very clear assignment of certain things provincially. We are what's called a confederation, which means sort of like our CMBA structure, where a lot of provinces housed together under a national umbrella called Canada. And certain things are nationally regulated, but the professions, the regulation of professionals, of licensing programs, it's all provincial. And so we can't do what you did in Australia, what was it, 10 years ago. I think it probably make a whole lot of sense. So in a way it's piecemeal, and we have different kinds of regulation for lenders. It's different in each province, and it's very confusing for the industry.
Yeah, I know for us to actually get to that point of a national regulation and licensing framework, it was, although it started in July of 2010, from memory, there was probably around a 7-year workup for us actually to get to that point. It took quite an enormous amount of time to get the wheels of conversations going between all the states. And then it got to a point where in late 2007, I think it was then taken over by Treasury, one of our federal bodies, to take it from all the state conversations to create this federal framework. And then it took a few years then before it was actually enacted. It's a lengthy process and certainly a challenging one. I can see time's moving in on me. My goodness, I've so enjoyed this conversation. I hope everybody else is too. But I thought I'd better quickly just touch on how is COVID-19 impacting your market over there? You guys going okay, or is it having a negative impact on your brokers?
Absolutely, it's had an impact. It has really slowed down the volume of transactions so drastically. So we have a much fewer number of property listings. I mean, fortunately, we don't have a problem with prices property prices really moving, because we've got a reduced number of buyers out there, but a reduced number of listings as well. So the transactions are down by 70%, maybe 80%. It's starting to move a little bit. So the realtors are impacted, the buyers and sellers are impacted as well. But because there's still a balance in our market between vendors and purchasers, we still have, if it's a good listing, we're still having multiple offers. So, if you take a look at what's selling, you'll have a handful with multiple offers. Actually, the price ends up over asking, in some cases significantly over asking. In a lot of cases, it's kind of close to the asking price. And in a few cases, I guess it's more desperate. It's way under. So the volume is down. The prices are relatively stable. Realtors aren't busy, but mortgage brokers are busy. Mortgage brokers are busy because people are looking at mortgage payment deferrals. They're looking at refinancing. They're looking at all kinds of financing solutions. People can't go to their branch because it's closed, or it's not as accessible as it used to be. So an interesting trend we're seeing is that brokers are increasing in popularity right now. It's not just the fact that they're accessible; you can contact them anytime. They're also, they're probably more knowledgeable than your branch personnel in terms of coming up with resourceful solutions, like deferral of mortgage payments and whatever you can do to refinance. So mortgage brokers are busy if they're experienced brokers. So, if going into COVID, you had an established referral network, established, client book of clients, you're probably doing okay. Some of our brokers have said this is the busiest they have ever been in their entire career. We had one mortgage broker that's been around a while, and she said she was about to retire, but she couldn't. She was far too busy to retire at this point. The newer brokers are, of course, not there. They're the ones that aren't getting the business, aren't getting the deals. So if you're entered into the COVID environment as an inexperienced newbie, you're probably struggling right now. But if you were a going concern and you had all these connections in place, you're doing very, very well.
I think we're seeing very, very similar sort of plays happening here in Australia as well, with those sort of trends because of established businesses versus new entrants in the market or newbies, and also activity. We sort of found it's the old anecdote: if you sit back and do nothing, that's exactly what happens, nothing. But those that are out there working their business are actually extremely busy and doing very, very well.
Yeah, so I think that everybody's concerned about the long term. At this stage, I think that people, our broker community, I think they're optimistic. We are hearing some concerning forecasts, economic forecasts. We are starting, the sector that really has been hit hard is the retail sector. So, we're starting to see a lot of defaults with retail owners. So that's very much a concern. So we've got some dueling debates from economists about how bad it's going to get. Are we going to have a recession? So we've got a lot of debt to pay back. We've got people are predicting higher taxes to pay for all of the the programs that have been put into place. So I think that I think we're doing okay now, but there's certainly watching out for how we get out of this. Some are saying 2 years, some are saying a year,
wow.
some are saying a year, 8 months, a year. I think one of the things that everyone's predicting is at some point there will be a sudden demand, unbelievable demand for housing. So we've got a shortage of housing. That's obviously because of our putting pressure on our house prices. But that's going to come back. And what's going to happen? We've got a shortage of housing. We've got to put people somewhere, and we don't have anywhere to put them. So at some point, we've got. I think we've got like a few million Canadians living abroad. So what we're planning to see is they're coming back with COVID to roost.
It sounds like I better be getting to property development in Canada then. Start building some houses.
Yeah, maybe. So those 3 million Canadians are going to come back to Canada. They're going to gobble up the houses, the housing market, putting pressure on it. We've also got a fairly, I don't know what's going to happen to immigration, but we've always had a reasonably healthy level of immigration to Canada. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, 8 months, a year from now, and then 2 years from now, what happens to the real estate.
Well, Sam, I'm almost out of time, so I better very quickly jump onto our conversation about the IMBF. As a bit of background for everybody, back in 2016, I was doing a research paper looking at various countries around the world on broker commissions because of the paper that ASIC wound up putting out called Report 516. So this was a prelude piece of research I was doing into that. And in my conversations, I wound up talking to Sam. And Sam then said to me, said, I'm thinking about doing this. And I said, really? I'm thinking something similar as well. And hence, what did we create? IMBF. So you want to talk a little about what IMBF's doing, and then I'm going to have to wrap up, unfortunately.
Well, who is IMBF? It's a collection of different jurisdictions from around the world. We've got the United States, the United Kingdom, Ireland. We've got Australia and Canada.
And Netherlands to one side as an associate.
Yeah. Yes, and I think it's interesting. You know, we get together every couple of months and have a conversation. We've got some plans down the road to have a little bit of a meeting or a conference. Referral networks. So if we've actually had some interest from Australian brokers looking for referral networks here in Canada, maybe vice versa. I don't know. So we understand there's a need to talk to our fellow mortgage broker associations, and this is the vehicle to do it. So it's providing a network, a platform for us to have a conversation with each other, understand what's going on in other parts of the world, and we can bring that back to where we are. So one of the things I did recently is I took a look at your licensing structure, your system of authorizations, and I used that to make submissions to our own government about how we should reorganize here in our jurisdiction. So that's the idea, is to understand best practices, what's going on, and with our neighboring countries, build referral networks. So it's a little bit of a work in progress.
But I think it does great stuff. I mean, like what you were looking at in Canada, I know I shared our commission structure details with Ireland, because Ireland's just gone through a commission review. And as I said, you've been looking at AML CTF Act and looking at our AML. And there's so many great learnings we can get from each other. I know I reached out to Rob Sinclair in London in the UK, a part of the Federation, where we're looking at credit card regulation that was going on here about a year and a half ago. And being able to share that knowledge and knowing that our regulators are coming to you and to other countries to shape policy back here in our own countries, it's important and invaluable for us to be able to learn from each other those experiences, share the intel, and help formulate our position, and that would be your position or whoever's position, on the policy back to the regulators or to government through those discussions. And to me, it's an invaluable piece of what the IMBF is doing. And I'm very excited about this upcoming conference, or we'll call it in 2021, when hopefully we're allowed to travel internationally, is getting a group of the top 30 or 40 odd brokers from around the world to sit down and talk about the issues and the pros and cons, and develop some very important papers off the back of that we can talk to governments around the world with. So I'm really excited about what we've started talking about there. It's early days of discussion, so I won't give any more away. But I think that's very, very exciting piece of work the IMBF will be doing. And that referral network, I know I've had quite a few people come to me that I've referred into the US and also into Canada, who are looking for referral networks or got clients buying over there. So again, this is a part of that value proposition, having a group of like-minded people together who are there for the good of their industries and their countries. In all seriousness, this is done because we want to, and we see the need, and we want to make sure we get the best outcomes possible. Sam, I've got to wrap it up because I'm out of time. So lovely to talk with you again. We'll talk again in a couple of weeks' time at our next video conference for IMBF. Thank you so much for being with us, and there's a massive round of applause from everyone who's watching. You can't see, but take care. Thanks so much for being with us.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Sam.
Bye.
All righty. So great to talk to Sam and her conversations of what's happening over there in Canada. And you can see why our regulators are constantly talking to Canada and using them as examples, as well as other country jurisdictions, because of so many similarities there and so many learnings. So the IMBF, the International Mortgage Brokers Federation, that Samantha and I actually put together and established, is an invaluable piece of work for us in Australia, but also for everyone who's involved around the world. All right, finishing up next week's guest. Next week, I'm really pleased to have with us is Ian Cragg from SendFX. We're going to have a discussion around foreign currency and what it means in transferring money in and out of the country, how that works for you and your clients, and the benefits in actually getting the right sort of company behind you when you're doing this. And not just walking the bank to send some money over to the US or into the UK or into Canada, is doing it the right way, and also making it a much more beneficial experience for you as a business person, but also for your clients, and being able to ensure you can track it and manage and monitor it. Really, really interesting conversation. And we'll also have Mark Windram, who is our state manager for Western Australia, South Australia and the Northern Territory, join us as well, so we can tackle your questions and talk further about what's going on in the broker market around Australia. So make sure you register and join us again for next Thursday at 11:30 for Q&A with Whitey. We have this, it'll be a really interesting and great conversation. Well, as we finish, once again, I'd like to say thank you to our sponsors for their support. It's really great to have them behind us. And of course, keep an eye open for an email you'll get off the back of this webinar that you'll be asked to do a short survey and give you a code for your CPD points. It's always important to get your feedback. And of course, if you want to watch this again or rewatch any of Q&A with Whitey's or the things we're doing in the FBAA, go to the FBAA's YouTube channel and you'll be able to rewatch them there. It's all CPD allocated, and you'll be able to catch up on anything you might have missed. Anyhow, stay well through COVID-19, and probably like you, I look forward to seeing you really soon. All the best and stay safe.